Go. All right. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Popular Music Books in Process. Um, this is around our 31st of these, so it's starting to feel like quite epic. And as always, we like to thank the Journal of Popular Music Studies, the POP Conference, and IASPM US for teaming together to be our sponsors. Kim Mack and Carl Wilson are my co-organizers, and Carl will be handling the Q&A today, so he'll be the one urging you to ask cool questions in the chat. Next week in the series is Anthony Reed's book, Soundworks, Race, Sound, and Poetry in Production. He's joined in conversation by Vijay Iyer. Pretty cool. But for today, we have one of our power trio kinds of events, 3 authors with books either out or in process on different aspects of hip hop research. As the group has coined it, Region, Radio, and Reality, New Directions in Hip Hop Research. So I'm gonna just introduce the panel and then kick it over to them to talk about their work. Starting with Daudi Abe, whose book is out, Emerald Street, a History of Hip Hop in Seattle. He's a professor, a writer, historian. He's taught at all sorts of levels, but for the past 15 years, a humanities instructor at Seattle Central College. Definitely part of the Seattle of the Stranger, the Seattle Times, but also part of a broader world, as seen in some of his roles with things like curriculum consultant at the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission. And he's got his book done. So congrats to Daudi. Now we've got someone whose book is on the way to done, Eric Harvey, working on a book coming out in fall of 2021, we think. October. That's fall.
Got my page proofs today.
Awesome. All right. It's real. It's real. Who got the camera?
Edits.
A History of Rap and Reality on University of Texas Press. He is an assistant professor in the School of Communications at Grand Valley State University. Has been in journals like Black Camera, the International Journal of Cultural Studies. I know him for being the friendliest face towards academics and other erudite people in Pitchfork, as well as writing for Spin, The Village Voice, Slate, all sorts of places. He's kind enough to note that this research started at the POP conference, so that's cool. And then, not as close to done, but recently publishing a major article showcasing this work, so it is now out there in the world in a major public way. Amy Coddington, whose book in progress is called How Hip Hop Became Hit Pop, Rap, Commercial Radio, and American Racial Identity, which is due to be published by University of California Press in 2023. She's an assistant professor of American music at Amherst College and tells us in her bio that we should, well, you'll tell us more about the book, but you should have said more about yourself. Come on. Exploring how rap broke through to a white mainstream audience in the 1980s and 1990s through programming on commercial radio stations. Finally, our moderator for today, Langston Collin Wilkins, a Seattle-based folklorist, ethnomusicologist, and writer. Research interests include urban folk life, hip hop culture. Am I right to think Houston is a big key thing? And African American music. Received Ph.D. in ethnomusicology from Indiana University. Many other degrees, but currently the director of the Center for Washington Cultural Traditions, a collaboration between Humanities Washington and the Washington State Arts Commission. So we are also very well represented in Seattleites. Langston, let me throw it over to you. Before I do, let me just note one last time, we encourage people all through the conversation to post comments in the chat. If you have questions, post them there as well, and Carl will call on you at the end. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm very happy to be here to moderate tonight's panel, Region, Radio and Reality, New Directions in Hip Hop Research. Each of these authors, Amy Coddington, Eric Harvey, Daudi Abe, are offering very new and critical areas of hip hop studies with their either already published or forthcoming books. Now, while very different in focus and approach, their books examine the growth and expansion of hip hop music in terms of geography and audience. And this growth, as their books and tonight's discussion will reflect, intersect issues of race, class, migration, industry, reality TV, and even more. So this will certainly be a very healthy discussion about new and important terms in hip hop studies. So with that said, in terms of format, we're going to go traditional conference style, with each author presenting their works for about 10 to 15 minutes or so. And then we'll move to a bit of moderated conversation amongst the panelists, and we'll close with audience Q&A. So moving forward, we'll start with Amy. Welcome, Amy.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks to the organizers for putting this together. Delighted to be in conversation with three rather brilliant people. So I'm just going to start with a little bit of a movie clip. So let me know, give me a thumbs up if you can see this. Yep, cool. Okay, awesome. All right, so the final scene in the widely panned 1985 movie Rappin' begins with Rappin' John Hood, the male lead, and his mighty crew rapping as they walk down the street, celebrating their recent success at driving several nefarious characters out of the neighborhood. Here's what that looks like.
Rappin' Hood and the merry men unite the neighborhood once again. What came down, we changed around. Red, yellow, white, black, and brown.
While Hood's merry crew more or less corresponds with the demographics of who was commonly understood as hip-hop's primary creators in 1985, it soon becomes clear that rapping is a flexible musical technique accessible to all, red, yellow, white, black, and brown. Walking down the street, Hood sees his white nemesis, Dwayne. As the backing track transitions from synthesizer-driven R&B to the twangy sounds of a banjo, Dwayne starts rapping.
I may not rap, I may not rhyme, but I got something to say this time. Hood, you okay? Hood, you all right? So let's use words instead of fists to fight. Now you're as cool can be, but you're still only half as cool as me.
The beat continues to morph as Hood walks down the street to find various other members of his multiracial community who all rap along to beats that crudely stereotype their cultural backgrounds.
In this neighborhood I got my steak, so I'll keep baking my bread and cake. Hooray!
If the Greek goddesses were here today, he'd welcome Hood home to stay.
Like in the days of ancient Rome, in love we welcome our heroes home.
Chinese proverb still holds true. Do good to others comes back to you.
Rappin' John Hood's the neighborhood's pride. We're blessed to have him on our side.
No one else can rap so good. It's my hero to Rappin' John Hood.
Rapping here is some sort of musical common ground. While each member of the community has their own music, a horribly cliched musical characterization of their ethnic or racial identities, they each use rapping to cut across these differences. But at the same time, it's also abundantly clear that rap isn't really a common musical technique shared by these neighbors. In many ways, Dwayne, the white boy, represents the contradiction that's so clear in this scene. Rap is just absolutely not for him. He says, I may not rap, I may not rhyme. But to put it bluntly, he's just rapping those lyrics. So is rap for everyone? And perhaps more interesting from my perspective, who decides? These two questions are at the center of my book called How Hip Hop Became Hip Hop. Drawing its title from a line in Pop Goes the Weasel, a 1991 song by the white rap group Third Base, which defends hip hop's boundaries by critiquing hip hop's pop turn. The book examines how rap transitioned from a New York City-based Black and Latinx subculture into an integral part of the American mainstream in the 80s and 90s, how it became music for everyone at the same time that it was resoundingly rejected as music for everyone. So to tell this story, I've turned away from the screen, although my co-panelist Eric's going to be discussing the screen in just a few minutes, and towards the radio. In particular, I'm interested in the top 40 radio format, the one that historically has played all of the hits. So in our Zoom host Eric's words, top 40 is a format made up of, quote, social outsiders looking to become symbolic insiders, a perfect place to look for how subcultures become part of mass culture. Could rappers be these sort of social outsiders who become transformed into symbolic insiders? In 1985, when Rappin' came out, the answer was just like a resounding no. Despite a half decade or so of popular rap singles, radio, no matter the format, just hadn't bought into what radio programmers, but also many others in the country, were still hoping was a youth fad. But by just another half decade later, everything had changed. So by the start of the 1990s, hip-hop had become a ubiquitous sound on top 40 radios. Rapped vocals, record scratches, and penetrating beats permeated these airwaves. My book, still very much in progress, that's why we're starting with me today, examines how and why this change occurred. So in my work, I argue that the radio, and top 40 radio in particular, acts as a barometer of sorts for understanding the relationship between what's typically called mainstream music and new musical styles such as hip-hop. I argue this not because the playlists on these stations are a good representation of popularity, anyone heard of payola, just as one example, but because of radio's relationship with a much larger industry, advertising. So commercial radio stations use music as a way to cultivate demographically specific audiences whose listening time they then sell to advertisers. This means that the music played on a commercial radio station is played not only because of its popularity, adherence to a musical style, or, God forbid, quality, but because it will attract a sellable audience of the right demographic. In other words, the advertiser-driven economic model of radio limits the sort of music that gets played on the radio. Foregrounding the voices of radio programmers fighting over the inclusion of hip-hop on the radio, my book documents how commercial radio stations attempted to balance listeners' growing interest in hip-hop with advertisers' race-informed complaints about the genre. Understanding this financial balancing act is central to the story of this book, which begins its narrative in the early 80s, just following the release of Rapper's Delight. So just a quick walkthrough of the chapters. So the first chapter opens with a comment attributed to the most influential Black programmer of the 70s and 80s, Frankie Crocker, who said that rap was, quote, too Black to be played on Black-oriented radio stations in the early 80s. He was not the only one worried about rap's racial identity, and this chapter narrates how Black programmers across the country were reticent to play hip-hop because many of the stations they worked for were rebranding to what were called urban stations by downplaying their Black identity and ties to local Black communities in response to pervasive reports of racial bias at companies that advertised on the radio. Black programmers' tepid response to the genre influenced its programming on other stations as well. So typically Black artists looking to expand their audiences beyond Black-oriented playlists need first to be played on a Black radio station. This provides them with the track record necessary to cross over onto other playlists. Black radio's unwillingness to play hip-hop songs thus meant that these artists wouldn't be played regularly on the radio on really any station. But in 1986, a station out of LA created what came to be thought of as a new top 40 sub-format, one which changed the way records crossed over from Black-oriented to top 40 stations. So known as crossover stations during the 80s and now called rhythmic or rhythmic contemporary, this top 40 sub-format was aimed at a young multicultural audience in urban areas and initially played music made by Black artists trying for a diverse non-Black audience, crossover music, or reverse crossover music, so music made by non-Black artists looking for a Black audience. As I detail in the middle two chapters of this book, it was on the crossover format that rap first found steady, regular airplay on the radio. These stations found ways to profit from the audiences generated by playing pop-influenced rappers like LL Cool J, MC Hammer, Young MC, Technotronic, and Vanilla Ice. The success of the crossover format and the rap hits they were playing did not go unnoticed at traditional top 40 stations across the country, who swiftly followed their lead and started playing rap as well. And so by the early 1990s, listeners across the country, not just in New York and Los Angeles, but in Topeka, Kansas City, and yes, even little me in Eugene, Oregon, heard rap as part of the everyday sound of top 40 stations. While crossover stations brought the sound of young people of color into the mainstream, this format failed to disrupt the pervasive structural racism of the radio and recording industries. The business practices of crossover stations, in fact, depended upon the white supremacy of the music industry sort of moving forward. As this format provided rappers a pathway to mainstream popularity, it wrestled control of hip-hop out of the hands of minority-led companies, becoming the new gatekeepers of rap's black sounds. Rap's influence on the mainstream, however, wasn't only a matter of sound. So rather, for a genre once considered too black to be played on the radio, its presence on top 40 radio stations signaled a transformation of the racial identity of the American mainstream. In my work, I understand the radio as an active producer of the way that we think about race, because its business model works by linking specific audience demographics to styles of music. Michael Omi and Howard Winant write that racial categories are created through what they describe as historically situated projects in which human bodies and social structures are represented and organized. Projects that through repetition and reproduction become ways of making sense of people in the world. So in my work, I contend that radio programming is one of these racial projects. So formats create what Omi and Winant term a racial common sense for understanding who listens to what. So while this all may sound a little bit like a typical radio scholar assigning a lot of import to the thing that I study and love, the radio format I analyze in the 4th chapter of my book lends credence to the theory that radio programming is about more than just music. So as rap's black sounds became a central component of the sound of the top 40 format, many became wary of its influence, and programmers created stations in direct opposition to the growth of this genre. In the final chapter of my book, I chart the response to hip-hop's exponential growth on the radio by narrating the development of what were described as safer top 40 radio stations designed explicitly to shield listeners from the sounds of rap. What came to be called adult top 40 stations loudly proclaimed their allegiances with no rap advertisements and offered the American public the chance to rewind to the days before rap was popular and before these crossover stations had brought the musical tastes of a multicultural public into the mainstream. And so by the mid-1990s, the top 40 format had fragmented into stations willing to play rap and stations intentionally excluding these sounds, dividing the American public into insular segments defined by their attitudes towards hip-hop and its multiracial audience. This, of course, is not the end, and the book's conclusion, which is very much unwritten, takes us into the present to see how we are still fighting over the inclusion of hip-hop in the mainstream, even as the influence of the radio has fallen with the rise of streaming platforms. And of course, this is not the whole story. This book only tells one part of how hip-hop became hip-hop. There's a lot left to be written, but I like to think that in highlighting how radio influences the growth of musical genres, and by taking music's role as a commodity seriously, I hope that it helps us make sense of the tension between popular music's expressive and political potential and its economic value, and helps us make sense of how hip-hop became the most popular genre in the country, while simultaneously failing to exact substantive political change and challenge racial injustice into the present. So to return to where I started, this story helps us not just understand how hip-hop came to be music for everyone, but also helps us recognize the consequences of such a transformation. Thanks.
Fascinating. Thank you, Amy. Eric Harvey, you're next.
All right, thanks, Langston. Mine might go a little bit longer than Amy's. I'm going to kind of remix a little bit of my introduction. I won't go for 45 minutes or anything, but it might be a little bit closer to 15. So I'll try to read fast if I seem to be dragging on a little bit. Okay, so the term gangster rap first appeared in a Los Angeles Times review of a March 1989 NWA concert. Of course, it was an apt coinage for a group with a hit single with that word in its title. Yet, while it worked well as a consumer genre that drew upon a legacy of outlaw mythology and American pop, the rappers themselves disliked the term and preferred a different descriptor. Ice Cube told one interviewer that, quote, "I still call it reality rap because our stuff is much more than just talking about gangsta things. Our stuff is talking about the social climate. To me, it means a network of information." Ice-T agreed, quote, "If anyone asked me at the time, I called it reality rap," he wrote in his memoir. "To me, it was street-level journalism, real-life observations told in poetry." To Eazy-E, the music was, quote, "the real story of what it's like living in places like Compton. We're giving them reality. We're like reporters." Tupac Shakur compared his music to war reportage from the front lines. Quote, "Because he had reporters showing us pictures of the war at home, that's what made the war end. So I thought, that's what I'm going to do as an artist, as a rapper. I'm going to show them the most graphic details of what I see in my community, and hopefully they'll stop it quick." Even Snoop Dogg, far from a political rapper at all, stretched the definition of journalism to define his music. On the Arsenio Hall show in 1994, he said, quote, "The situations I deal with on my albums is reality, the same things the news is bringing you. But I'm bringing it to you live and direct like the news can't give it to you because I know it. They're just scared of it." Like reality TV producers and personalities, reality rappers understood their term of art as a comparative one. The first listed definition of reality in the Oxford English Dictionary, after all, is, quote, "the world or the state of things as they actually exist, as opposed to an idealistic or notional idea of them." It's that definition that spawns phrases like "the harsh reality of life in the hood," or "stop being polite and start getting real." As a programming format, reality television pitched itself as a true-to-life and shocking alternative to the medium's escapist fare, but with an overt entertainment value that distinguished it from the evening news. Networks drew a bright line between reality entertainment and news reality. It's important to note that the first wave of reality television, which started in the late 80s, either came from Fox, which had no news division, or was produced by independent companies and licensed by syndicators. Rappers' reality emerged from a similar dialogue, serving as a signal that they were uncovering shocking truths about Black lives that were absent not only from the nightly news, but from the safe world of Black dance pop and R&B. Because they kept their distance from reality rap, Black radio became a key enemy of Ice-T, Ice Cube, and Public Enemy. When NBC started airing the first network-produced reality show, Unsolved Mysteries, in 1987, the network aired a warning before each episode to distinguish that reality from that of its news division. What you're about to see is not a news broadcast. Likewise, at the start of Straight Outta Compton, Dr. Dre alerts listeners that you're about to witness the strength of street knowledge. Reality entertainers were warning the squeamish, nodding to the censors, and issuing a tantalizing dare to everybody else. As the most outspoken and political rapper at the moment that hip-hop was transforming itself from party and club music to a political force in Black popular culture, Public Enemy frontman Chuck D tasked himself with defining the music to outsiders. In a 1988 interview with Spence John Leland, Chuck famously condensed rap's communicative affordances into an aphorism: "Rap is Black America's TV station." The rest of that quote often gets lopped off, but it's just as important. Chuck added that rap offers, quote, "a whole perspective of what exists and what Black life is about. And Black life doesn't get the total spectrum of information through anything else. They don't get it through print because kids won't pick up magazines or books really unless it's got pictures of rap stars." Far from mere shock tactics, Chuck saw Public Enemy as a communications empire with a political benchmark. In another widely circulated quote, he claimed his goal was to create 5,000 new Black leaders. What better medium as metaphor was there than television, which transmitted a potent mixture of entertainment and news to tens of millions of Americans? As the 1980s ended, Public Enemy sounded an alarm with Welcome to the Terror Dome, a single that reported from the front lines of white on black violence around the country, like the murder of Yusuf Hawkins by a white mob in Brooklyn and the black fraternity event in Virginia Beach that turned into a police riot. It also offered an update on the group's own notoriety, sparked, of course, by Professor Griff's notorious anti-Semitic remarks to a reporter earlier that year. At a Manhattan New Year's Eve show in late 1989, Chuck called the track a black male correspondent's view of how we looked at 1989. He added, "I don't look at Ted Koppel. I'm not going to look at 1989 like the New York Times is going to look at it." Instead, Chuck viewed the dawning decade as a moment of reckoning for Black Americans. Quote, "The 1990s are coming, and if we as a people do the wrong thing, the Black situation is out of here at the end of the decade. The Terror Dome is the 90s. The explosion of anti-rap sentiment in 1990 gave credence to Chuck's fear. That year's two most critically acclaimed rap albums, Public Enemy's Fear of a Black Planet and Ice Cube's America's Most Wanted, were as controversial as they were popular. That summer, an Indiana CD plant refused to duplicate the new album from the Ghetto Boys because the company found the lyrics on songs like Mind of a Lunatic revolting. Ice-T titled his third album Freedom of Speech, and on it he included an attack on Tipper Gore, whose Parents Music Resource Center, after 5 years of lobbying, had convinced the record industry to adopt a voluntary parental advisory sticker that year. One of the biggest stories of 1990 was the First Amendment case of Two Live Crew, which was triggered by Nick Navarro, the flashy Florida sheriff who, yes, starred in the pilot episode of Cops. On rap albums and TV alike, reality entertainment emerged from the red-hot center of what we now call the culture wars, which conservatives had raised to a fever pitch in the first full year of the George H.W. Bush administration. In an interview with Time magazine that year, Illinois Congressman Sidney Yates connected the tumult to the foolhardy crusade to snuff out Hollywood communists in the 1950s. Quote, "You've got a fight going on today that's just as emotional as the fight that took place then, except communism isn't the boogeyman. This time, it's pornography and obscenity." America's existential foe since the 50s had seemingly vanished the previous November as the world watched the Berlin Wall crumble on live television, a globally televised spectacle representing the end of communism and the global triumph of liberal democracy and free markets. Caught up in the fall of the wall rapture, policy analyst Francis Fukuyama dubbed the moment the end of history, ? Arguing that the end of the Cold War symbolized, quote, "the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy." Where do we go from here? One suggestion came on March 3rd, 1991, 30 years ago last week. On the same day that General Norman Schwarzkopf accepted the Iraqi surrender and ended the Gulf War, the first fully televised war, which the world watched live on CNN as it happened, a Los Angeles plumber named George Holliday stepped onto his balcony and shot camcorder footage of Los Angeles Police Department officers brutalizing black motorist Rodney King. The shaky black and white video footage of the Pentagon's smart bombs that had proven America's post-Cold War military superiority was swiftly replaced by shaky black and white footage of sworn officers declaring war on the flailing body of a black citizen. A year later, President Bush's Attorney General, Bill Barr, reassigned more than 300 FBI agents from Cold War-related duties abroad to street gang control in 39 American cities. It was the largest reallocation of manpower in the Bureau's history. The war had come home. Welcome to the Terror Dome. Fukuyama's end of history argument was, of course, roundly criticized as scholarship, but his general idea raised an interesting cultural question. What happens to the American imagination and the national conversation when the nation state's existential enemies have been conquered? As the 2000s dawned, a Vanity Fair critic ventured a response. The 1990s had been the tabloid decade, a 10-year period marked by the rise of advanced technology and increased vulgarity. Fueled by the dramatic expansion of the television universe and the consumer video market, and later the rise of the internet, a sensationalist new mindset had eradicated the boundary between the highbrow world of mainstream journalism and the lowbrow world of supermarket tabloids. Americans spent a decade obsessing over lurid and salacious stories, culminating with the nearly 2-year O.J. Simpson saga and the minutely documented affair between President Clinton and his intern, Monica Lewinsky. The cultural theorist Kevin Glenn named the brave new world of the late 80s and early 90s tabloid culture. to describe the hyper-real and populist space that took shape in three forms. First, there was Fox's true crime novelties, Cops and America's Most Wanted, and their dozens of successors. Second was the syndicated sensationalism of daytime talk shows hosted by the erstwhile TV journalists Phil Donahue, Oprah Winfrey, Geraldo Rivera, and others. And third was the lurid primetime tabloid news troika, A Current Affair, Hard Copy, and Inside Edition. TV execs gobbled up tabloid programs because of simple economics. The combination of sensationalism and populism drew significant ratings at a bargain. There were no writers or actors to pay, just a few hosts and some skeleton crews. And the stars, they were drawn from the growing population of Americans eager to see themselves on television by any means necessary. The journalistic establishment was none too pleased about a new crop of pretenders to their throne, where they had reigned since the 1950s as the august arbiters of America's discursive reality. In 1992, Washington Post reporter Carl Bernstein reprimanded what he called the, quote, idiot culture of modern news. Quote, for more than 15 years, we have been moving away from real journalism toward the creation of a sleazoid infotainment culture of journalistic titillation, in which we teach our readers and our viewers that the trivial is significant, that the lurid and loopy are more important than real news. Bernstein was joined in his animus by no less than Chuck D, who in his 1997 bestseller, Fight the Power, Rap, Race, and Reality, condemned on page 8 what he called the filth and garbage news of the piss press, and regretted that, quote, the commercial success and popularity of tabloid programs have caused the local, national, and world news programs to become more tabloidistic in order to keep up their ratings. Chuck was being a bit selective here, given his association with people like Louis Farrakhan, who steered the Nation of Islam directly into the tabloid spotlight in the 1980s. But this does not make Chuck hypocritical at all, as much as it reveals tabloid culture's spread. Those right in the eye of the storm might not recognize the breadth. In 1992, the media critic John Katz was kinder, referring to the news-style discourse that had spread throughout the entertainment industry as new news. On TV and films and on rap albums, new news was sharply attuned to a younger, more populist perspective on the events of the day, instead of the official stories emanating from the corridors of power. He mentioned boundary-pushing shows like Murphy Brown and Roseanne, but Katz was especially enamored of rappers and Black film directors' ability to force political discussions on race into the heart of the national discussion. Examples abounded. You get Public Enemy's 1992 music video for By the Time I Get to Arizona, which he says catalyzed the debate over the recognition of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday far more effectively than any Meet the Press debate. The fact that the Rodney King video in 1991 effectively verified NWA's reporting from 3 years earlier, or movies like Boys in the Hood dealing with race far more fairly and effectively than the nightly news. The new news that Katz described had usurped the old news because a growing percentage of the American population didn't feel that TV or print was telling the whole truth, or at least their truth. Of course, what Katz observed in 1992 had been years in the making. 3 years before Chuck D called rap Black America's TV station, sociologist Joshua Meyrowitz published an influential study examining how the rise of television had occasioned a seismic shift in American consciousness, from its roots in words to a new visual landscape governed by electronic signals. While the written word creates meaning through symbolic abstraction that requires various levels of education to parse, TV tells similar stories with the condensed, simplified moving images of other humans doing things. Television by no means presents reality, he asserted, but television looks and sounds much more like reality than sentences and paragraphs do. It's been well chronicled that the generation of reality rappers who transformed hip hop and popular culture between 1986 and 1996 came of age amid the peak period of 1970s Black street realism. But they also watched a ton of television. And in the 1970s, television was increasingly populated by Black faces and stories more than ever before. The 1970s witnessed a vast expansion of Black programming, offering more nuanced stories and character depth, leading Black television scholar Christine Atcham to recall, quote, growing up in the 1970s on a staple of Black cast television programs, I rarely considered that the face of TV had ever been primarily white. Ice Cube and his producer Sir Jinx were total couch potatoes. In one interview, Cube told Dee Barnes that he thought of his brain as a VCR. Tupac is quoted in Resurrection as saying when he was a kid, quote, "I watched TV all day. I stayed in front of the television. Just by being myself and looking at TV, at families and all these people out there in this pretend world, I knew I could be part of it if I pretended to. So early on, I just watched and emulated." When Chuck D told Spin that rap was Black America's TV station, he meant that his medium was perfectly suited to sample the practices, tropes, sounds, visuals, and identities of television journalists, pundits, documentarians, and primetime producers. Or maybe Dr. Dre put it best when he recommended chilling until the next episode. Reality rap programming pushed back against the law and order culture fostered by Ronald Reagan, who spent the 1980s recasting crime as the top domestic problem and pulling Black men into a starring role as the nation's lurking criminal menace every night on the evening news. Once viewed as an unprofitable loss leader guiding viewers toward primetime, local TV news broadcasts, which were really the quintessential forebearer for reality television, were transformed into technologically sophisticated profit-making machines in the late 70s by adopting satellite-equipped news vans and ever smaller cameras. Nightly newscasts were renamed Eyewitness News and Action News and featured colorful graphics reading live, on the scene, and late breaking. Viewers were pinned to their couches each evening by hyper-real lawbreakers who weren't Hollywood creations, but were members of their local communities. And Black citizens bore the brunt of this tantalizing fear-mongering. During the waning years of Reagan's presidency, a crop of young Black cultural entrepreneurs emerged to forcefully counter-program his conservative law and order revolution with a harsh reality of their own. Far more than rhyme notebooks and street corner ciphers, reality rappers were artists of the recording booth, digital sampler, and mixing desk. Their extravagant truths only realized in the unpredictable context of late capitalist circulation. Music videos, interviews, liner notes, publicity photographs, magazine profiles, and op-eds. They served as discursive foils to pro-cop programs like Cops and America's Most Wanted. They slipped into the role of talk show hosts who compellingly illustrated the ills and joys of Black lives in America. They delved into the tawdry sensationalism of sex, money, and murder that was the stock and trade of evening tabloids. And they issued album-length political programs about everything from Black self-sufficiency to the relevance of the First Amendment. And when they purposefully crossed the boundaries of good taste by sinking into anti-Semitic, homophobic, or misogynistic muck, or when they refused to draw boundaries around real and performative violence or political action, reality rappers became the quintessential subjects of tabloid culture, generating nonstop headlines about their on and off record actions and antics. Reality rappers played numerous on and off record roles: dead-eyed killer, street reporter, free speech advocate, barbershop bullshitter, talk show host, nationalist world builder, plain talking pundit, sensitive thug, and minority entrepreneur. But across all of these, they were expert provocateurs, stoking postmodern moral panics out of law and order paranoia and trolling the racial dog whistles of the new right's family values discourse. Riding the first wave of reality entrepreneurship, rappers negotiated a series of social, cultural, technological, and industrial shifts to wage a tabloid struggle with the powers that be over the representation of Black lives in America. In the process, they helped establish a precedent that holds fast deep into the next century. What we know as reality is comprehensible only after being forged in the crucible of popular culture. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And finally, Daudi.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be among you all today. A couple things. There is a discount code, I believe, in the event materials for 30% off the book, and the link as well. And also, I see someone in this audience named in the book as well. So I see you, Joseph Schloss. Salute. Okay, so I'm going to read a little, well, it's kind of broken up. So I'm going to read a little bit of the tail end of the introduction to Emerald Street. And then there's a question later on in the discussion concerning race. So I'll be having a couple of pertinent paragraphs to go along with that we'll revisit when we get to that question. You'll see what I mean when we get there. Okay. Any discussion about the roots of Seattle hip hop must begin in the Central District, the traditional home of Seattle's African-American community. As Dr. Quintard Taylor wrote in his book, The Forging of a Black Community, Seattle's Central District from 1870 through the Civil Rights era, quote, Black Seattle through much of the 20th century was synonymous with the Central District, a 4 square mile section near the geographic center of the isthmus that constitutes the city, end quote. Although Seattle's first Black resident, Manuel Lopez from Cape Verde, arrived in 1858, the city did not have a significant African-American presence until the World War II migration, which increased the population from 3,789 in 1940 to 15,666 in 1950. By 1970, Seattle had 37,868 African Americans, with the vast majority living in the Central District. Beginning in 1970, Seattle's Black population expanded south into the Rainier Valley, doubling the geographic area, but not the population of African Americans in the city. As those Blacks moved south, they integrated previously white neighborhoods. They were joined by new immigrants from Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the African continent. By 2000, Southeast Seattle, known locally as the South End, zip code 98118, had become one of the most racially diverse neighborhoods, not only in Seattle, but in the entire United States. Hip hop arrived in the city in the 1980s amid these rapidly changing ethnic and racial dynamics. In many ways, the rise of Sir Mix-a-Lot in the 1990s or Macklemore in the 2010s reflects the unique social climate in which each emerged. Beginning with the release of Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang on New Jersey-based Sugar Hill Records in 1979, hip-hop sent cultural shockwaves through young people in the Central District and the South End, which would eventually travel to other parts of the city. As neighborhoods transformed and gentrification became an issue, local hip-hop documented the changes. Over time, emceeing or rapping became the most commercially viable aspect of hip-hop culture. This was also true in the Pacific Northwest, and several local artists have achieved mainstream hip-hop's ultimate symbol of validation, a rap Grammy, first awarded in 1989. In fact, Seattle-bred artists claim back-to-back rap Grammys. In 1993, when Sir Mix-a-Lot's Baby Got Back won the Grammy for Best Solo Rap Performance, and in 1994, as Ishmael Butterfly Butler and Diggable Planets won the Grammy for Best Rap Performance by a duo or group for their song, The Rebirth of Slick, Cool Like That. At the 56 Grammys in 2014, Macklemore and Ryan Lewis walked away with 4 awards, including Best Rap Performance and Best Rap Song for Thrift Shop, Best Rap Album for The Heist, and Best New Artist. Macklemore's run of independently released music, eventually reaching #1 on the charts, gained supporters worldwide and won accolades as the ultimate do-it-yourself rags to riches music story. However, this was not exactly uncharted local territory. Although Sir Mix-a-Lot was signed to Rick Rubin's Deaf American Recordings by the time he won his Grammy, he had already made his bones at Nasty Mix Records. Formed in 1985, Nasty Mix became perhaps one of the most unlikely success stories in the history of music. In an era when New York City was still the center of the hip-hop universe, serious doubts were cast on the legitimacy of nearly all material that came from elsewhere. The fact that an independent rap label based in Seattle, of all places, had released 2 platinum Mix-a-Lot albums in the late 1980s shocked the hip-hop world. Shocked, I say. In addition to a do-it-yourself ethos, Mix-a-Lot and Macklemore also shared a willingness to musically go against the grain of their respective eras. In his breakout hit, Posse on Broadway, Mix-a-Lot reversed field on the rising popularity of super macho West Coast gangster rap by calling out domestic violence in his reference to using mace to defend a woman from her abusive boyfriend. Similarly, Macklemore and Ryan Lewis's songs Thrift Shop and Same Love countered 2 of hip-hop's most popular and oldest norms: bling, the celebration of expensive jewelry and name brand clothing, and homophobia. In addition to its lyrical diversity, the unique nature of hip-hop from Seattle has continued to defy any particular label or sonic aesthetic. Whereas New York hip-hop, for example, had traditionally been associated with Roland 808 drum machines and California hip hop relied heavily on synthesized and funk-based samples, no dominant style ever took hold in Seattle. It has long been maintained that there is no specific way to categorize Seattle hip hop. This is in stark contrast to the grunge rock movement of the 1990s, which was initially known as the Seattle Sound. Although Grammy Awards function as a standard means of recognition, this book also explores the radio booths, community centers, social protests, nightclubs, immigrant communities, and dance studios in Seattle that made all of this possible. The full story of hip hop in Seattle reflects the variety of activities and achievements that form the fabric of community and help to create the music. In the mid-1990s, for example, local legend B-Boy Fever One became the first breaker from Seattle to join the pioneering, world-famous New York-based Rocksteady crew. Fever eventually returned to the Seattle area, and while spending time mentoring young people at Jefferson Community Center, he met young Jerome Ski Aparis. Fever saw a special quality in Jerome Ski, who in 1999 co-created and led the Beacon Hill-based breaking crew Massive Monkeys. Massive went on to win world championships at international break competitions in London in 2004 and Seoul in 2012. Seattle has also produced a stable of DJs and producers who have collaborated and created songs for some of the biggest names in music. Central District legend Vitamin D has worked with many local and national hip hop acts as well as rhythm and blues artists. As an incredibly versatile producer, Vitamin D has such diverse credits as arranger, audio engineer, audio production, executive producer, horn arrangements, keyboards, mixing effects, cutting, and piano. Among younger generations, he is known for producing the theme song for Power, a popular TV cable urban drama series. Vitamin D protege Jake One has produced for the likes of De La Soul, E40, 50 Cent, Cypress Hill, T.I., Ghostface Killah, Snoop Dogg, G-Unit, Wale, and Drake. Jake One received Grammy nominations in 2012 for production credits on the album Some Nights by the group Fun and the single Three Kings from the Rick Ross LP God Forgives, I Don't, nominated for Best Rap Album. In addition to world-renowned artists, Seattle has also produced The Flavor, an internationally read hip-hop magazine produced by Allison Pember and Rachel Crick between 1992 and 1996. Beginning as a quarterly before becoming a monthly, The Flavor at its peak distributed more than 10,000 free copies every month at record stores across the United States, as well as in Denmark, Great Britain, and the Netherlands. Since hip-hop's beginning, fashion and style have been signature aspects of the culture. From Run DMC's shell-toe Adidas sneakers to baggy jeans and hoodies, the physical presentation of clothing choices was a way to express an allegiance with hip-hop. Seattle natives Tony Shellman and Lando Felix helped define street fashion when they launched the urban clothing company Mecca USA with Evan Davis in 1994. Creative differences with their corporate partners in 1996 led Shellman, Felix, and Davis to walk away from Mecca USA, after which they simply turned around and started the fashion line Iniche in 1997. Despite the rap stars, the Grammy Awards, breakdance championships, magazines, and fashion boutiques, the true foundation of the Seattle scene is something different. Grassroots organizing and engagement of the community by individuals and organizations has been the defining element of local hip hop. In the early 1980s, a young Sir Mix-a-Lot made a name for himself by playing parties at the Boys and Girls Club in the Central District. In the late 1990s, the event known as Sure Shot Sundays, produced by Jonathan Wordsayer Moore, in response to a lack of live all-age hip-hop events in Seattle, created a space for youth, including a young Ben McLemore Haggerty, to perform on stage for the first time. The Seattle chapter of Russell Simmons' Hip Hop Summit Action Network was created in 2002 by Y. King Garrett, and in 2004, Daniel King Chasm Kogita established the local chapter of Africa Bambaata's New York-based Universal Zulu Nation. For more than a decade, 206 Zulu has partnered with numerous schools and nonprofits in Seattle, providing youth-centered activities, informational forums, educational workshops, leadership development, and documentation of local hip hop history. Hip hop in Seattle offers a lens for some of the changes that have shaped the region over the past several decades. For example, gang violence that accompanied the crack epidemic of the mid-1980s was discussed in Union Street Hustlers by Ice Cold Mode. Dre's used The Hood Ain't the Same to outline the gentrification of the Central District. The growing East African and Asian Pacific Islander immigrant populations were represented by such artists as Militia Mali Mob and Prometheus Brown, respectively. Although Referendum 74 legalized recreational marijuana in Washington state in 2012, local hip hop had long before embraced cannabis culture with songs like DMS's Sunshine, albums such as Nacho Picasso's Blunt Raps, and groups like the Stay High Brothers. Also on that ballot in 2012 was the Same-Sex Marriage Measure Initiative 502, which passed using Macklemore and Ryan Lewis's Same Love as the theme song. Ultimately, the story of Emerald Street is the story of community. The compilation albums, hip-hop themed forums and conferences, countless talent shows and open mic sessions, willingness to collaborate with potential competitors, and an emphasis on serving youth have all combined to produce a vibrant, diverse hip-hop scene in Seattle on nearly every level. The range of this community exists not only in a racial and socioeconomic sense, but also in the various styles, energies, and ideologies that different participants have continued to bring to the collective. Okay, so that's that. So now just a couple of paragraphs just that I think are good bookends on issues of race here in Seattle. So this is from chapter 1. African-American settlers who first came to Seattle in the mid-19th century were drawn by the region's free air, meaning the absence of the most blatant policies and practices of racial discrimination that were a part of everyday life for Black people in the Southern United States. African-American men, for example, routinely participated in civic life in Seattle at a time when voting prohibitions and terrorist tactics drove post-Reconstruction era African-Americans away from the polls in other regions of the country. Black men in Washington voted throughout the territorial period, and the Washington Territorial Suffrage Act of 1883 briefly made it possible for Black women to cast ballots until that law was struck down by the Territorial Supreme Court in 1887. Although it would be incorrect to claim that racism and discrimination in the Pacific Northwest was never an issue, those dynamics certainly look different in Seattle than they did in other parts of the United States. Okay, and so now contrast that with, this is the first paragraph in the conclusion. On January 20, 1966, Reverend John H. Adams of First AME Church told the advisory committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission hearing, quote, "Seattle is one of the few cities left in America which can solve its racial problems before it becomes unsolvable," end quote. In this statement, Adams spoke for numerous Black, Latino, Native, Asian, and white residents who, quote, "still summon the courage to believe in a peaceful racial future for the city and the nation," end quote, wrote Dr. Quintard Taylor in The Forging of a Black Community. But that optimism has yet to be fully justified. Over ensuing decades, racial tensions have been further inflamed by such issues as police misconduct, educational inequities, and increasing gentrification. Taylor concluded, quote, "Indeed, Seattle's apparent success and its underlying failure in its race relations paradigm has been its meticulously crafted image, which promoted the illusion of inclusion." Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all. My mind's moving in many different directions. But as a sort of a jumping off point for our, I guess, conversation portion, if I were to put your three books in conversation with each other, the West Coast plays a prominent role. So for each of you in your respective areas of research and your books. Why was the West Coast such a center for hip hop expansion? And I'm talking between the mid 80s and the mid 90s. And feel free to jump in.
I could jump in and start. It's I mean, it's a really good question, and essentially, you know, the reason I was writing about this moment was because, you know, it was hip hop's move west, I think, that really sort of reconfigured what hip hop meant on the national scene. I mean, I think it's, you know, poetic, if not, you know, maybe historically accurate to say that it sort of expanded the boundaries and turned it into, I mean, it didn't, you know, necessarily make it, this isn't a value judgment or anything, but it kind of turned it into more of sort of a widescreen format. And, you know, you had personalities that were very different, and they were in, you know, if you read old interviews with Ice-T or Eazy-E, you see that they were, you know, really kind of dead set on sort of making a name for where they were from, sort of against the kind of dominant East Coast paradigm. And I don't think you know, in my book, I think it's also, you know, important that, you know, this is sort of like the Hollywoodization of hip hop to a small degree. I think, you know, the sort of metrics for performance, you know, shifted and mutated a lot. And I think it was, you know, a really interesting, you know, compelling moment for you know, hip hop's transformation and kind of moving west. And you know, I don't think it's, you know, coincidental. It's like kind of in the shadows of the greatest myth-making apparatus in human history, Hollywood. You know, you kind of turned hip hop into this sort of you know, massive world conquering force. So that's kind of my take.
My take is actually sort of, I mean, I'm just going to use Daudi's other book as a great example. So in this book, there's this great interview with Young MC, which we were talking about right before this, where Young MC says something like, in the late 1980s, New York City only represented about 4% of the record buying public, right? People in New York, for a variety of reasons, just weren't buying as many records as people in California. So Young MC makes this point that, like, you can get a platinum record just by selling records up and down the West Coast. You don't even have to go, you know, he's like, maybe you want Phoenix, right? Maybe you want Arizona, but like, you really don't have to go any further east than that to make it. So for me, there's this sort of like, just the idea of a bigger hip hop audience, right? It makes more sense to be out of California in some ways.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that you know, I was saying, in one part I was just kind of saying that, you know, at a certain point, New York was still kind of the sun, the Mecca, and, you know, in that the book that Amy just held up, there's also an interview with Ice-T in there, and he's talking about, Ice-T in that book is talking about how LL used to come out to Los Angeles and talk about how garbage, you know what I'm saying, the rappers out on the West Coast and in LA specifically were. So I think that there was a little bit of a, how would I say, maybe a goddish complex about New York people and people in New York and hip hop New York. I'm kind of speaking specifically to that. Whereas people, at least in Seattle, people, you know, when Rapper's Delight comes out, people very quickly figured out that if you wanted to make your attempts at rhyming relevant, you weren't going to be able to talk about subways and, you know, 30-story public housing buildings, because that's not what we had in Seattle. And so in Seattle, just like pretty much so many other places, you kind of drew from the cultural stockpile of life as it existed at the time. And so you have this area which is geographically isolated in a lot of ways. That is something that a lot of critics over time have said gives a place like Seattle the feeling not to have to copy what other people are doing, in Posse on Broadway, it would have been very easy for Mix-a-Lot to kind of follow that was at the very tip of gangster rap becoming very popular. So it would have been easy for him to go down that road, but instead of that, he talks about solving his problem of trying to stop a man from assaulting his girlfriend by using mace. That is not anything what gangster rappers were talking about down in Southern California. But then also you have the kind of traditionally problematic antagonistic relationship in Los Angeles between the LAPD and the Black community down there. And so that hip hop was going to sound different in terms of addressing those issues than it did in other places. So I think that because at its essence, rap music has always been about talking about telling who you are and what it's like where you're from. And those kind of nuanced details that come from different places is something that I think has distinguished the genre from just about anything. I heard Nas one time on a documentary talking about, listening to the Ghetto Boys. Hip hop is a transmission of information, and listening to the Ghetto Boys, he knew everything he needed to know about Houston, Texas. And so being able to share those details, let me tell you a quick story. So I went down as an undergrad to the Bay Area in the fall of 1988. And this was shortly after Posse on Broadway started coming on Yo MTV Raps. And when I got down there and started meeting people who listened to hip hop and found out I was from Seattle, they started asking me questions like, yo, what's Broadway like? Or, yo, are the burgers at Dick's good? These are small details that they would have never, about Seattle, they would have never known about, except for the song and the music kind of spreading that out there. So I think so many people were because it's not like it's not that we had heard enough of New York, but we had heard plenty of New York. We were now interested in details that were coming from different places. And so I think that the West Coast really took that and ran with it, just in terms of making a statement and saying, okay, it's fine, we're not from New York, but we are from here, and here's what it's like here. And so I think that the detailed exchange of information like that was one thing that the West Coast artists definitely grabbed very tightly upon.
If I could just quickly piggyback on something that Daudi said here. I love this phrase he used, cultural stockpile, this sort of idea that there's in popular culture, it kind of represents this sort of set of reference points that we can kind of meet each other on. And without making Langston feel too old, I want to go back to 2008 when I came up with the idea for this book, and Langston and I were in a seminar together, the great Dr. Portia Maltzby at Indiana University, and I was trying to think of a way in to writing about hip hop, and I kind of went back as a teenager in the suburbs of Indianapolis, not exactly the kind of space that's represented anywhere in popular culture with good reason. But one of the connections that I made, and I remember talking to Langston about this sort of in the hallway outside of the seminar, was that when hip hop moved to LA, the kind of cultural stockpile it started drawing from were houses with lawns, riding your bike down the street, kind of sitting on the porch with your friends, right? And obviously I'm light years away from the experience of the young men and women who were making this music. But I looked at this and I was like, oh, wow, no, this is like, in some weird way, I can kind of see, like, that's kind of what my house was like when I was growing up, right? I had a fence, I had a lawn, I had a bunch of crap in the lawn, sometimes like the beginning of the G-Thing video. And, that was sort of a connection I made. And in the later part of the book, I write about Snoop, the rise of Snoop as this, sort of, I don't know, galactic sized pop star in 93, 94, where, he crossed over so fully, I think, in a way, and I kind of positioned him against Tupac in a way, who was doing something obviously very different with his career, but Snoop was really appealing to the suburbs. in a very profound way. I mean, at the beginning of the Gin and Juice video, his parents go out of town and he throws a party in his living room. And you know, the What's My Name video, it's like you're hanging out, you get caught kind of in your bedroom with your girlfriend, you know, and these are very sort of like relatable kind of pop movements, and you know, it's a different kind of relationship to the music than you know, kind of understanding obviously what it's like to be an African American living under Daryl Gates' nightstick. But at the same time, I was like, you know, that was really a connection point for me in a way. I was like, I never found myself connecting as much to New York rap, because the city just looked, you know, and the references were completely alien to me. But something that was suburban and quasi-suburban, it lodged itself in my brain, and it made Snoop a trillionaire. So, you know, I think it also, you know, kind of making that crossover connection as well.
And if I can piggyback on something you just said, Eric, there was a switch for a time when it could be argued that LA and Southern California became the center of the hip hop universe in the early 1990s. And speaking of someone like Snoop, I'm not sure that to that point, at least within hip hop, maybe within music, but at least within hip hop, we had seen someone who was such a big star, but had yet to release an album of their own. Snoop was like a superstar before he even released Doggy Style. You know what I mean? And I think that kind of attraction really speaks to the interest that area was drawing from the larger kind of national hip hop community.
Yeah, 100%. You know, I think, sorry, Langston.
Go ahead.
You know, and that attraction was, you know, to a large degree, pretty, you know, you know, the way I describe it is sort of tawdry. You know, we you know, a lot of people like Snoop because he was this outlaw figure, even though, I mean, if you read, you know, read his biography and read interviews with him, I mean, he was trying to keep this stuff at arm's length. You know, this life at arm's length, you know, he really didn't want to be wind up like Tupac, you know, and even at kind of the peak of his fame, he's trying to say, look, I want to be a pop star. I want to be somebody who can kind of represent where I come from, but also transcend it in a certain way. And, you know, making the cover of Newsweek and Time and Rolling Stone and all this stuff, you know, and then Doggy Style drops. And then he's at the VMAs, and then he's escaping the LAPD out of the back of the VMAs after giving En Vogue the award. And, you know, it was just absolutely mesmerizing. And there was this debate on Twitter a few months ago, or maybe it was 10 years ago, who knows, where it was like, who was bigger at their peak? You know, was it Tupac or was it Snoop? And I don't know, man. It's hard to get bigger than Snoop was, I think, in 93, 94. I mean, you know, just as somebody, again, I'm an eavesdropper on this culture, right? This is how I open my book. You know, I'm grateful to have the ability to write about something that is not, this isn't my culture, right? I'm experiencing it as mass culture, and I'm writing about it as media. But good God, Snoop was like, I mean, he was everything in 93 and 94. I mean, he was just transcendent. And, you know, the way that, and, you know, he didn't even get off until 96. I mean, that was how long it took to exonerate him. But anyway, I just think that's another aspect there. I'll shut up now.
And if I could ask a quick follow-up question, and then we can move to audience Q&A. But Snoop, as you kind of mentioned, was the perfect convergence of, I guess, pop and gangsta. But taking a step back from him, it was pop rap and gangsta rap, I guess, kind of separately, that took rap to the mainstream in the late 80s and into the 90s. So I'm wondering, how did this dichotomy between pop and gangsta reflect the demographic makeup of the hip hop audience at the time and in this period? And, you know, Amy, I'm really curious to see how this plays out on the radio.
I guess I can start off then. So I think one of the things that is important about thinking about pop rap and gangster rap is that they're really being marketed towards completely distinct demographics, right? So women and young tweens and even younger are the real market for pop rap, right? Thinking about pop rap cartoon, right? MC Hammer has his own cartoon, like companies like Lego using rap in their commercials. It's really being marketed towards this like little kid community and also then their parents, right? And gangster rap is, I mean, for the most part, is being marketed towards young men. I think there's tons of tons of women who love gangster rap, myself included, but right, that the way the industry is conceiving of these two audiences is like, okay, well, we need a little bit of rap for everyone. So let's there's going to be some artists who we market towards, PM Dawn, marketed kind of towards moms, right? And then there's artists that are marketed towards kids, Kid and Play, perfect example. And then we get artists that are marketed more towards young teenagers, young male teenagers. And Snoop is the prime example of that.
I'm feeling like there was for me anyway, one of the attractions that I found around the variety was the variety of stuff that was coming from the West Coast. To that point, it felt like just anecdotally that there wasn't a lot of variety necessarily per se, and a lot of what was coming from the East Coast. However, once you get to the West Coast in the late 80s and early 90s, it's almost like there's the entire spectrum. You want this PG stuff? We have Young MC. We have MC Hammer. You want this PG-13 stuff? We have Tone Loc, who has a song like Wild Thing, which is a euphemism for having sex, or, the Humpty Dance, how Humpty Hump is talking about in his 69, his Humpty nose will tickle your rear. And so it was on the edge, it was kind of naughty, but not over the top. And then if you want really to go overboard, with the R-rated and, XXX stuff, we have NWA, and we have Too Short, and we have Ice-T. And so there was something for everybody. And I feel, I suppose I should be referencing the newer book than the older book, but in that interview with Young MC that Amy was talking about from 6 in the morning, there was something that was so interesting that he says in that interview. And he talks about how he was approached by an older white woman, kind of when he was at the peak of his popularity and powers. And this woman says, thank you, for your art. I don't let my kids listen to rap, but I let them listen to Young MC. And I thought that was an interesting distinction. I thought that the distinction that this lady was making between rap music and between something like Young MC, it just goes back to that idea of the variety and how much of it was there for so many different people. If you didn't like this, they had this for you. If you didn't like that, they had that for you. It was very inclusive in a lot of ways, because even though it was different styles of West Coast music, it was still kind of fell under that umbrella of West Coast hip hop, and as such just had so many different choices for so many different people from so many places.
Yeah, I think that both of these comments really kind of get at the kind of underappreciated richness of hip hop, at this moment. As it was sort of, I like to say that, hip hop kind of went through its punk and pop phases at the same time. It's like you had NWA coming out at the exact same time that you had Young MC and all the Delicious Vinyl crew, and it was sort of, you were able to kind of merge into whatever lane that you wanted to. One of the things I write about in my book, a couple things I think that are kind of indicative cultural artifacts of this moment. I think the movie House Party, I think, was a huge moment. Here you have a movie that is, again, aimed at teens. It really kind of set off, I think, in a way, if you look back at the history, the sort of wave of Black directed movies that were kind of hitting multiplexes that would kind of, go on in the next few years with John Singleton and obviously Spike Lee. One of the big themes, the enemy in House Party, it's cops. It's two shithead cops, right? Who are chasing everybody around, right? They're chasing Kid and Play around. They're chasing. They're just kind of harassing Black citizens, which is, I think, a little bit of the influence of reality rap, gangster rap, whatever we want to call it. And so you're seeing that influence in kind of mainstream hip hop crossover of the sort of themes and ideas that were coming out of Los Angeles. And the other thing I think that's really interesting is the charity single "We're All in the Same Gang," which I'm sure we all remember from '89, which debuted on Arsenio. You know, and it was you know, put out by you know, it's produced by Dre, but it also, I mean, you know, most people bought it nationally because it had Young MC, it had MC Hammer, right? And it, you know, and it ends with Eazy-E, right? Who he does, you know, oh, it has Tone Loc, right? A Crip, right? Who's on the track. He's like, and you know, one of the interesting commentaries on this track, I think, is that's so interesting is that it was written by Jonathan Gold, R.I.P., in the New York Times or in the L.A. Times, where he's saying like some of these rappers are doing backflips in order to avoid being anti-gang because it's going to hurt their reputation, right? Young MC has no problem with this, right? MC Hammer has no problem with this. Shock G, Humpty Hump has no problem with this. But then you see Eazy-E comes out there and is like libertarian guys kind of saying, you know, I'm not here to preach. Or no, that's MC Ren. He says, I'm not trying to tell you what to do. You have your own freedom of choice to listen to, right? And he's just like, you can kind of do whatever you want in the anti-gang track. And Tone Loc, he's almost nostalgic, right? When I was young, he's sitting on a front porch in the video and he's kind of reminiscing about his gangbanging days. And then he's kind of like, well, don't do this, right? And so there was this really interesting kind of tension in that single. I kind of put it in dialogue with the Stop the Violence movement from a couple of years earlier, the KRS-One and Chuck D kind of moment. But yeah, that moment of crossover, I think, is, you know, there's still so much work to be done on it.
Thank you. So we should probably move to audience Q&A.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, everybody. You hear me okay? So we have a few questions. The first one is from Sarush, if you want to unmute and ask.
Oh, okay. You want me to read it out? I could just read it. I mean, yeah, I was just curious if Amy could talk about, you know, she mentioned Frankie Crocker was opposed to rap, saying it was too black. I was just, you know, kind of real curious about that. What does that mean that it was too black? Because Frankie Crocker was also a radio personality that would rhyme. When presenting records in the 70s, a lot of people named themselves after him. He was the Chief Rocker, Frankie Crocker, Mr. Hollywood. And so he's kind of like a proto rapper. So I'm just curious, like, why, and I've heard before that he was opposed to rap. So yeah, just curious if she could talk about that. And also, you know, there's songs like Stethasonics, Talking All That Jazz, which is like, you know, a rap group basically responding to criticism they were getting from radio stations that were calling it basically not music and not deserving of airplay, basically. So yeah, she wanted to add anything to that.
Thanks for that question. It's a great question. And there's a couple different ways to think about it, I think. So Frankie Crocker is a Black person programming for a mostly Black audience, right? And so his job is to play music that his audience will like to hear, but also that his advertisers think is going to attract the audience that they want to be, you know, that they want listening to those advertisements. And that second part is kind of the crux of it, that Frankie Crocker, as he's going out and selling advertisements, he's selling his audience like, okay, you know, last week we had a 75% Black audience, but I'm trying to get that down to 70. So will you buy time on my station? And rap in, you know, most programmers especially in the early 80s, there's this conflation of kind of, the socioeconomic age and racial identity of rappers and people who listen to rap that then gets kind of, right, Frankie Crocker in saying they're, rap is too black. It's not really just about race, right? It's about whether or not those people are interested in buying the big ticket items that the advertisers are trying to, promote on his station. The other thing that's happening in that era is also Frankie Crocker is getting a ton of criticism for not programming records that are released on Black-owned record labels. I think this is a payola issue, right? That they don't have the kind of money to grease the pockets of the biggest programmer in New York City, and so people are boycotting his station for that reason in the early 1980s. And then, like, the other side of this, right, is that Frankie Crocker is trying to attract wealthy audiences by moving towards a Quiet Storm, a Quiet Storm formatting style, and so those aren't the people who are interested in rap as far as he knows.
Great. Okay. We're gonna move. I'm gonna go to Jody first, and then use Nina's question as a way to kind of wrap up. So Jody, if you want to ask yours.
Hey, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. There's a couple children running around here, so I'm worried. I'm going to speak quickly because I don't want it to get loud and crazy. But I'll just read my question. Eric, I was asking about. Thank you, by the way, all three of you for your presentations. It's fascinating. Awesome. Thanks. Eric, can you talk a bit about the rise and demise of Black power politics and aesthetics in hip hop in the late 80s and early 90s and its relationship to the advent of West Coast centered reality rap, what you call reality rap? Seems to me you have a heady moment from like 88 to late 92, early 93 when what you call reality rap is explicitly linked to Black nationalist politics. I'm thinking of, people are rapping about Farrakhan, Nation of Islam. You have these 5%er rappers. I'm thinking of PE and Ice Cube, but also artists like Paris, remember Paris? And even artier acts like X-Clan and Brand Nubian, et cetera. And then in the early 90s, maybe it's a bit too neat, but right around the time The Chronic was released, that Black nationalist rhetoric seems to just evaporate. And I've heard a lot of theories for the reasons for the shift, and I'm sure record companies have something to do with it. But I'm just curious for your perspective and how this relates to more broadly to your work on reality rap. So I'm going to mute.
Awesome. Thanks, Jody. Yeah, so I read about this a lot in the book. There's a couple moments that I can, I don't have an overarching theory. I do have my kind of sort of more micro theories about why this works. I mean, the big one is, capitalism. But I think that, so I opened my book with NWA on Arsenio Hall, and they kind of pretend to do a cops sort of moment. They do a kind of a shaky cam, getting beat up by the cops, and then they come and they perform 100 miles and running. But before that, they do an interview. And a couple months before, Eazy-E had gotten into some hot water in a Spin magazine interview by sort of dismissing the sort of red, black, and green kind of pro-Black movement in hip hop by saying they don't give a shit about Compton. Why should we give a shit about them? And so, Arsenio asked him to kind of talk about it. Eazy-E, I don't know if people seen this clip, Eazy-E's wearing a Jason goalie mask or hockey mask and a straight jacket, and he's like, has a switchblade. He's not talking. So MC Ren and Dr. Dre, Ice Cube had already left by this point, kind of take up the mantle, and they're like, essentially kind of making the same claim, which is sort of a parochial claim, which is saying, again, like, we're putting on for where we're from. We don't have any truck with and they bring up, Chuck D and Public Enemy as sort of the avatars for this. And so that was one moment where you can kind of see a bit of a kind of schism within this world of the folks who are more, everybody's politically involved, of course. There's trillions of different types of politics, but and this obviously, that was the year 1990 when Nelson Mandela was freed from prison, and I mean, and Jeff Chang has kind of gone on for so long and Can't Stop Blowing Stuff about kind of how this happened and this movement. And it made its way into hip hop. So I think I write about Fear of a Black Planet. I probably write too much about Fear of a Black Planet because I think it's an absolutely fascinating album. This is obviously the album that comes after Public Enemy's album that was explicitly linked with Louis Farrakhan. That was where he kind of shouts out Louis Farrakhan, and then obviously Professor Griff, who was the one who brought Nation of Islam, into Public Enemy's sphere, playing Farrakhan tapes on the bus, that kind of stuff. Farrakhan's kind of an absent presence on Fear of a Black Planet. He's really replaced by Frances Cress Welsing, who is sort of they call her a melanist or a race scientist, and it was equally controversial, but it wasn't controversial in a Nation of Islam way. It was controversial in a different way, and it seemed like that was a symbolic moment, at least in my reading, of Public Enemy sort of distancing itself. And obviously you have tons of great groups, Poor Righteous Teachers, X-Clan, all these great nationalist groups, Rakim, Big Daddy Kane, I mean, so many. But you also had Ice Cube in Express, who wrote the lyrics to Express Yourself, right? Some say they're dropping science, well, I'm dropping English, right? Dropping science, that's a 5% term, right? And he says, I'm dropping English, right? And I think that's a very subtle but clever way of saying, East Coast, you're doing your thing. You have your kind of cosmology, but we're doing what's kind of related to life on the streets here in Compton. And so I think it's an interesting schism. I get into it in my NWA chapter a little bit more. And the final thing, as you mentioned, I think in your book, geez. In your forthcoming book about bikes, but in your question, I'm sorry, was the Chronic, and the Chronic was, I think, the moment when you can kind of cleave off kind of nationalist rhetoric in hip hop, right? This is the moment on Let Me Ride, where no medallions, dreadlocks, or black fists, just the gangster glare with the gangster raps, the gangster shit makes the gang that snaps, and this is really kind of Dre saying, look, this nationalist stuff is just not profitable enough. And so we're hip hop in the future is sort of moving in a different direction. And at the same time, you had Tupac, who is kind of a postmodern Huey Newton, who, if you read Touré's article in the Village Voice in 1995, where he's saying, Tupac's entire life is this big performance, but without the sort of political commitments necessarily that Huey Newton had. This could be another moment where you kind of sever off the nationalist trappings, and then you kind of go fully into sort of floating above the world, performance or celebrity. So I guess that's kind of a long-winded way to get at that question.
We're going long, but we don't normally have 3 books, so it feels like appropriate that we do. Just to wrap up, but I'm going to ask you to be concise on a broad question. Nina Walia asks what you think the relevance of gangster rap, or we might say reality rap, is today. And I think maybe just to wrap up, like if each of you could say something brief about how you think the period that you're covering foreshadows things about what's happening in hip hop today, that might be a nice way to close out.
I can go super quick. That's my whole last chapter of my book is tying this moment, 86 to 96, to the current moment, really the kind of the Black Lives Matter moment. And so just the phrase "fuck the police," FTP, has really kind of entered the popular lexicon, I think, as a protest anthem, as something you can spray paint on the wall. In that legendary sad picture of Donald Trump walking to do the what do you call it, the photo op in front of the church with the Bible, right? Somebody from Reuters or Getty snapped a photo of Trump walking in front of this massively spray painted wall, and here he is walking, and what's spray painted on the wall right as he's walking over there, but FTP, right? And I think that more than anything, you know, the solidification of that phrase that Ice Cube wrote into a sort of protest anthem is, or just a 3-word, 3-syllable or 4-syllable phrase that kind of sums up so much. I think that is a good summary of the legacy of this moment.
Others?
Well, I'll just say real quick, just this isn't exactly what you asked, but it's kind of just, it is a bit of an extension on the conversation, and kind of the consensus is that in the early-ish 90s, there was kind of that turning point. And if I were to be asked for where I would kind of point the finger, I would say with the release of the NWA album, Niggas for Life. And the fact that that album debuted at number 2 on the Billboard Pop chart, and then the next week entered number 1, displacing Paula Abdul, who, you know, in teaching a hip hop class, you know, a lot of the kids who are taking the class are like teenagers and early 20s. And so they may really only know Paula Abdul as like, you know, what she does now. But at that time, I mean, she was Taylor Swift, she was Beyonce, she was whoever you want to, you know, the top female performer, vocalist, at least one of them at the time. And so the fact that NWA was able to displace her with the kind of material that they had on that album really, I think, sent a message to record companies, because at that point, a lot of record companies in the hip hop game were smaller, kind of mom and pop type operations. But now you have these conglomerates who are seeing clearly how much money can be made off of these albums. And so they're coming in, they have budgets that, you know, can kind of elbow these smaller places out the way. And the larger corporations are not concerned with the artistic integrity, you know what I'm saying, of the culture. They just want to know what made the most money and how can we replicate that. And so I think that point right there really has a lot to do with the tenor and tone of the music and kind of gangster rap, quote unquote, becoming the mainstream. Whereas up to that point, gangster rap was kind of on the margins of hip hop. We think about a group like Public Enemy, who was so overtly political and was like the mainstream of hip hop. And that mainstream starts to move a little bit into the direction of gangster rap. And so I think that part there, really sending that signal to corporate America, the resulting of that comes from that, and the eventual, 10 or 15, 20 year, whatever it is now, kind of creative rut that some people feel like hip hop is in, I feel like can be traced to a large degree to that moment.
Yeah, I similarly agree that moment right there is a real turning point in the way that hip hop is, right, that it comes into the mainstream. I mean, right, one of the albums that gets knocked out of the number 1 slot right before that one is REM's Out of Time, which has rapping on the first track, right? So, and Paula Abdul notably has a rapper on her song a year earlier. So it's a great touch point for the way that hip hop kind of infiltrates all of these other places as well.
Okay, great. Well, we could go on all night, but we shouldn't. So I just want to thank Daudi and Amy and Eric so much, and for a great presentation, and remind you all that if you want to share this with people, it'll be up hopefully on Eric's YouTube page in the future, along with all of our sessions.